everyone, today I'm going to be doing something kind of different. I think it's going to be really fun. I'm going to try out natural dyeing using some flowers that we have growing in our garden. So I know this is kind of different from what I normally share here, but I thought I'd just share it with you all because if you're anything like me, you're kind of like obsessed with everything natural. And as I've been doing research into natural dyeing, I've just noticed that a lot of the things that are used as natural dyes are things that we already had growing around our yard. So I thought maybe you guys would have these things as well and would like to see the process. I've been really fascinated by natural dyeing and the idea that you can get so many different colors with just plants and foods. And like I said, a lot of the things that you can use for natural dyeing you might already have. So it might be just like a fun little project for you to try out. I'm pretty new to this. I have only done it one other time. I tried doing it last week with some coreopsis flowers, which I will show you, and that turned out really well. And today I am going to be trying Echinacea flowers, also known as cone flowers. And we have cone flowers all over our yard because we just had like a few plants around here when we moved in, and they have spread everywhere. So you can see a really nice hardy patch over here. And they are a really great flower to have on your homestead because they just attract a lot of pollinators. There's always bees and butterflies on here. And it's also something that is used a lot medicinally. So there's a good chance that you already have this in your garden. And the thing with natural dyeing is that you don't always get the color you think you're going to get. So these flowers have just this gorgeous, like bright pink purple color. But from what I've researched, the color you actually get from these is maybe anywhere from like a yellow green to an army green. So I think that's really cool. Here's the coreopsis that I used the other day for my first dyeing project. I think this is usually in wildflower mixes. It's a really easy to grow flower from seed. And Erin picked out this seed packet before I even started to get an interest in natural dyeing. And it turns out that this flower is one of the most common ones used for dyeing. And sometimes it's known as dyer's coreopsis. I don't know if that's like a specific variety within the coreopsis family, but it is a really great dye plant. And for this one, I think the color you get is a little bit more obvious. I ended up with like a golden yellow orange color, which you can kind of see is in like the flowers and centers of the flower. And I'll show you that later because it turned out really, really cool. And today I'm going to be picking some more of this. I'm not going to be using it in today's dye project, but I'm just gonna set these aside to dry. And that way, like during the winter, if I want to do another dye project, I'll have some of these dried flowers. I think that usually it's best to use fresh plant material, but this one in particular I've read is okay to be used as a dried material, so I want to make sure I have plenty of this set away for those winter months when I'm just like stuck inside and maybe just need a little bit of a project. As I've been doing more research into this, I just think it's really cool how many different flowers and plants and foods you can use for dye. And if you do some research and go down the list, you'll probably find something that you already have growing in your yard. A lot of weeds even can be used as a natural dye. So I just think it's really cool and fun. So right now I'm gonna go pick some of the Echinacea flowers as well as the coreopsis flowers, and then we'll bring them inside to do our dye project. One of the reasons I've become so interested and invested in natural dye is because I have really been learning about all of the detrimental effects of the textile and fashion industry. I think a lot of people these days are learning about how bad and wasteful fast fashion is, but one thing I never really thought about until recently is how the actual production of fabrics and dyes can be so harmful for the environment and also for the people working in those conditions. These days, many colors that you get on your clothes are made using chemicals, and that can create a lot of water pollution because all of that wastewater that is now contaminated ends up in surrounding areas, which is just really not great for the earth. And we are always just striving to do things with the least amount of harm as possible. And I think that other than food, your clothing choices can make a really big impact on your environmental footprint or just being more self-sufficient or sustainable. This is something I have felt strongly about for quite a few years now. At this point, I rarely buy any clothes new because I just do not want to support the fashion industry at all, and I thrift most of my clothes, but just learning to take it one step further and create something that is completely handmade and with natural dyes that are not harmful and made with things that we can find locally or on our very own property, I think that's just a really cool skill to learn. There are also a lot of ethical and social implications into the production of clothing, whether you're talking about the factory conditions for the people who make the clothing or for conditions on the farm for anyone who has to work on the production or the picking of really labor-intensive crops such as cotton. And I'm really not trying to shame anyone for their choices. I know that not everybody is in a place where they can or want to make their own clothes or dye their own fabrics or yarns. But I do want to provide this information because I think the first step to making changes is to have that information. A lot of things are just not set up for us to have the facts to make informed decisions, and a lot of that responsibility unfortunately does fall on the consumers. So I think just learning a little bit more about what goes into the things that we use and buy every day is really important. So if that's something that you're interested in, maybe you can go and do your own research and decide what kind of choices or changes you can implement into your life, whether it's taking up making your own clothes or changing up the types of fibers that you shop for in your clothing, or maybe just purchasing secondhand, which I think is a great thing to do because you are also saving money at the same time. And it's something that I think anyone can do no matter what your circumstances are. So that's just a little bit of a background of like my intents and purposes and kind of what drives me, because this whole process that I am going to be going through is a long one. It is something that, yes, I am doing it because it's fun, but I feel like there is a deeper intent behind it. And for me, that's what makes everything that we do and all the choices we make sustainable. Just knowing that it has a really important reason driving us to do these things, because with everything that we do on our homestead, you know, growing and preserving your own food, cooking all of our meals with the healthy ingredients that we grow, taking care of our livestock animals, all of these things take a lot of dedication and time. And if you don't have that drive that is pushing you to do it every day, then ultimately it's just something that we are not going to be able to sustainably put all of our energy into. So sometimes it's just nice to remind ourselves of the reasons that we do all of these things. So this is what I ended up with, and I think it's going to be plenty to work with. So I'm going to set aside the coreopsis to dry for a later date, and then today I will just be working with the Echinacea. But that is such a beautiful basket of flowers and natural dye. So what we're going to do now is basically make like a flower tea out of this. We are going to be boiling these flowers in a pot of water. And to save myself the trouble of having to strain it later, I'm just going to be using this cheesecloth to wrap it up. And that way I can just take the whole thing out later. You can see this cheesecloth is actually colored because I used this in my last dye project. So you can see it's kind of like yellowy orange. So I'm going to place all of my echinacea flowers in here, and we're just going to make like a giant tea bag. And I have not measured these flowers at all. I don't know how much this is. I am just using an amount that I think will be enough. Like with most things, I really am not very precise about it. And this whole thing is just an experiment anyway, so we're just gonna wing it and see what happens. So I'm just tying this off with some twine so that my flowers don't come out in the pot. And I have a pot of water on the stove right now, a pretty large one because you want there to be enough space later on when we add our yarn or fabric to be dyed that it can move around and float freely in that dye pot. And by the way, whatever pot you're using for dyeing should just be like an old pot that you're not going to use for anything else, because you don't want to contaminate your food pots, because some dye chemicals or even plant matter can be poisonous, so you don't want to cross-contaminate it. So here's my little satchel of flowers, and I'm going to stick this in my pot. For the pot, I'm going to keep it at a very, very low simmer, but like not even a simmer really. It's just going to be basically hot. We don't want to overheat it because heat can kill a lot of the color compounds, and we want to keep as much of that as possible. So I'm going to keep it in the pot for at least half an hour up to an hour, and then after that I'm going to be adding the thing that I'm going to be dyeing. So here is what I am going to be dyeing. It's a skein of cotton yarn, just bare yarn that has no dye on it. And this is specifically for your own dye projects. I got this yarn from Knit Picks. It is 100% organic cotton. If it's accessible and you're able to afford it, I would suggest getting organic cotton if you are going to be dyeing cotton, just because cotton production does use a lot of pesticides. So yeah, I'm going to be dyeing this skein of cotton yarn because I have really been into knitting lately. And I will say that from the research I've done, plant-based fibers might not take dye as well as animal-based fibers. So cotton yarn might not absorb the dye as readily as, say, wool. But the reason I'm doing cotton is because I am just going to be dyeing one skein at a time. And if I just dye one skein of wool, there's not much I can do with that other than like make hats. But if I do this one skein of this really thin fingering weight cotton, I think I would have enough even to make like a tank top out of this, which I think is really cool. But there are plenty of different fibers you can dye. You can do cotton, wool, alpaca, linen, really whatever you can find. And it doesn't have to be yarn either. You can just do like regular fabric. If you just get like a sheet of linen or cotton, that would be a cool thing to try out. I'm just doing yarn because, like I've said, I've been into knitting lately, so I think it would be cool to be able to knit something using my own hand-dyed yarn. And as a disclaimer, I also want to say that this whole process that I'm doing, I am skipping some steps. There are some things you have to do to prepare your fibers. Specifically cotton, I know that you have to scour your fibers, which is when you boil it with some kind of chemicals that break down any of those like oils or things on the cotton that will prevent it from absorbing dye. The second step is usually mordanting, which is when you soak it in another chemical or substance to make the fibers more readily accept a color. So I am skipping those steps simply because honestly, I didn't want to buy more stuff. I didn't want to buy specific chemicals or powders that I was only going to use for dyeing because I just wanted to try this out. I don't know if I'm going to be doing it that much, and I didn't want to buy this stuff if I was only going to be dyeing a few skeins just for fun. So I completely skipped those two steps when I did my first experiment, and it actually turned out pretty well. So here is the first skein that I dyed last week using coreopsis. I think it turned out so cool. You can see it has like a golden yellow color. And you can see it does kind of have like variations in there. Some areas are more like butter yellow and others are more of like a red orange. And this might be because I skipped those 2 steps, but honestly, I just think it's really cool anyway. And I don't mind that it has a bit of that variegation. I think it just makes it look like a really fancy hand-dyed yarn that you would buy at a yarn shop. So I don't mind at all. I think that it still took up the color really well with the coreopsis. We'll see how it does with the echinacea. But yeah, I just think the result is so stunning. Actually, if I take it out of the, if I untwist it, you might be able to see some more of the variations. I just think it turned out so cool, and this is all just from the coreopsis flowers. I didn't prep the yarn at all. So yeah, even though I am skipping some of these steps, it clearly still ends up with something, and maybe it might not be as light fast as if I had like taken the proper steps. But if the color does fade, I think I'm actually okay with that because the natural color is very beautiful. And I realized that this natural color is very similar to another yarn that I bought the other day when we went to a local yarn store. So I picked up this yarn. This one is also 100% cotton. And I realized that I basically just bought the same exact color as an undyed cotton. So clearly it's a color that I already like. So if it turns out that whatever color I dye the yarn fades over time and gets lighter and eventually maybe even fades to the normal color, I'm pretty okay with that because I actually really like the natural color. So I have the echinacea that is kind of like simmering away on my pot, and I just have to let that kind of steep in there for half an hour, and then we'll come back in half an hour and then I can put my yarn in. Actually, the one prep thing I am going to do with this yarn is I am going to untwist it so that it's like this big loop, which is how it comes when you buy it in a hank that's ready to dye. And I'm gonna soak this in some warm water just so that all the fibers become completely saturated with water, and then they'll be able to absorb the dye once they go into the dye pot. So I'm just gonna do that in a bowl while my echinacea flowers are simmering away. That way they'll have half an hour to just soak in all of that water, and then I can put them in the dye pot after. I added my yarn to the pot after about an hour of simmering those echinacea flowers, and at this point I could kind of see that the liquid was like a greenish brown kind of color. It did look pretty light, so I was a little bit doubtful about the color of that because when I did the coreopsis, I could tell right away when I put my yarn in that it was changing the color, and for this one it kind of did that, but it was very, very faint. So what I decided to do was I left the heat on to the lowest setting with the yarn in it for the next hour, and then I put the lid on the pot and let that sit overnight to completely cool down. So the stove was not on, it was just sitting in that like warm liquid as it cooled down over the next 24 hours. When I came back the next day, it still just like didn't look very dark. It had a little bit of that greenish gray color. You can see how it compares to the bear yarn. It's definitely a different color, but it's just not a very vibrant or very pleasant color. So what I decided to do was I added a few black-eyed Susan flowers. I just did this on a whim because this is another flower that I wanted to try dyeing with, and I read that these ones are a good dye flower that will give you a good either green or brown pigment. And I just went ahead and threw a few of those in the pot. There were not that many that were blooming, so I just was able to scavenge up a few of those, whatever I could find, and I just tossed them in. And then again, I turned on the heat to a very low setting and let that water get hot again and let that kind of like simmer a little bit for half an hour. And then again, I just turned off the heat, covered my pot, and let that cool and sit for the next 24 hours. So I came back the next day and there was a little bit of a difference, very, very slight. I think that it was a little bit more pigmented, but honestly still like not really the color I was going for. And I just decided at this point to take it out and let it dry, and I would see how it looked like when it was dry because it's kind of hard to tell what the color is when it's wet. So I took it out and wrung out all of the excess liquid. You can see when I squeeze it out, the liquid definitely is like a little bit green, but again, just not very pigmented. So I wrung out all of the water and rinsed out any of that excess color, and I left it outside out of direct sunlight to dry completely. Here is what it looked like when it was dry. You can see it's a very, very muted greenish, grayish color. And again, I'm comparing it to the natural cotton color. There's definitely a difference, but it's not a huge difference. And I noticed that on the fibers, there were some areas that had like a pretty nice, like dark green color. And I think that's where it came in contact with the black-eyed Susans, and it seems like those had a lot of pigment on them. So what I decided to do was to completely do this process all over again, and I picked a whole bunch of black-eyed Susans, and I'm just going to re-dye that same skein of yarn, but this time just with the black-eyed Susans, not with the Echinacea. So I picked a whole bunch of those. By this time, the black-eyed Susans were really starting to bloom a lot more, so I was able to find a good amount of those, and I just repeated the same process. I put those in my little cheesecloth sachet, put that into a fresh pot of water, and simmered that for half an hour. And with these flowers, I was able to tell right away they released a lot more color than the Echinacea. Within like 15 to 30 minutes, almost immediately the water in the pot turned like a brownish color, and then after half an hour it was a really nice deep brown. So I was feeling pretty good about this. I thought that this would give a much more pigmented result. So after an hour or so on the heat, I added my yarn to this really dark brown liquid, and then I turned off the heat and let that sit for another day in that water. So again, this is a very long process. It's definitely something you need to set aside time for and be a little bit patient with the process because it does take time to extract all of these colors from the plant matter. You can probably tell that that yarn was already starting to take up some of that pigment, so I was really happy about that. Here's the yarn the next day. You can see it's this beautiful warm brown, and now it's time to take it out of the pot because I think it has absorbed as much of the pigment as it's going to. So again, I rinsed it, wrung it out to dry, and hung it underneath a shady tree. There's something about this part of the process where I hang it on the branches of a tree that I think is so quaint, so #cottagecore, and I just think it's so adorable. So it's actually been, I think, over a week since I filmed that first part of the video, and this has been a little bit of a longer process than I thought it was going to be, and this is the finished result. I think it is so pretty. It is showing up a little bit lighter on camera, but it's really like a very nice kind of muted grayish brown. We were trying to decide what would best describe the color, and we both decided it looks a lot like buckwheat soba noodles, especially because the yarn actually looks like noodles. So I think buckwheat is like a good description for this. I think it's very, very pretty. I'm a lot happier with it than I was with the Echinacea, although it was still really fun to try both of them, and that's kind of the thing when you're working with natural dyes or really anything natural. You never really know what's going to happen, and that's kind of the fun of the experimenting. So I'm still glad that I did the Echinacea and the Black-Eyed Susans, but I guess there is a reason why Black-Eyed Susans are more commonly known as a dye plant and Echinacea isn't really. The reason that I didn't go with the Black-Eyed Susans to begin with, even though I did want to do those, is just because they weren't in bloom a week ago, but now they are starting to bloom, so I have plenty to work with, and that's why I decided to go ahead and try those. But if I had just waited an extra week, I probably would have just done those in the first place. Since I had to wait about a week in between my batches for those flowers to be blooming so that I could use them fresh, my dye pot was empty and I kind of was itching to try something else out. So in the meantime, I did actually try out another experiment with my last skein of yarn, and I ended up with this really beautiful, kind of like a pinky lavender color. This one I dyed using wild blackberries that have been growing all over our yard this year. They are not like the best to eat because they're very small, the plants are very thorny, and they're kind of sour sometimes, but I thought it would be perfect to try for a dye experiment. I'm not sure how light fast berry dyes are, but I am just so happy with the color. It's so pretty. And I think different berries would give you different colors, so in the future maybe I'll try like raspberries and blueberries. But I just thought that this was such a great use for a wild plant that we can just forage on our property that we're not necessarily eating a lot of. It's a nice way to still have a use for it, and I just think it's so fun. So I just want to show you my total 3 skeins from my natural dyeing experiments together because I think they're so gorgeous together. So here are the 3 of them. So the one on the left is my first experiment with the coreopsis. This one definitely has the most variation. You can see a lot of like yellows and oranges, and I would say it's the most vibrant as well, which makes sense because coreopsis is a very well-known classic dyeing plant. Then the middle one is the one that I first dyed with Echinacea, but then over-dyed with the Black-Eyed Susans. You can see it kind of has like a greenish undertone that I think comes from the Echinacea, but for the most part, it's like a nice muted beige brown. And then the one on the right is from the wild blackberries. Honestly, I really love them all. I don't know that I could choose a favorite. And I know that the one that I showed you most in this video was this like kind of tan brown one, which maybe isn't the most exciting color. I kind of wish I had showed you the process for the other one since the colors did turn out a little bit more fun and vibrant. But in the end, I think that this tan color is the most wearable out of all of these anyway, so I'm pretty excited to make a garment out of this. I think what I'm planning to do is I'm going to be knitting a tank top mainly in this nice lavender color, and I'm going to embroider some daisies on it, and then I'm going to use this golden yellow color as like the center of the daisies. I think that's just going to be so fun. And then with this like tanner brown color, I'll just make a separate top out of that. But anyway, I just thought this was such a fun experiment. I am thrilled with the results, and I am so excited to try out more things. I just want to like pick everything that I can find in the yard and try more natural dye experiments. Some of the things I'm planning to do in the future are some like food waste items as well. So yellow and red onion skins are ones that are really popular for dyeing. Also avocado skins and pits. So those are 2 that are definitely on my like to dye list as soon as I can get my hands on some more yarn. I hope you guys enjoyed seeing this process. I'm not really sure how many people are going to be interested in this, so let me know if you want to see my future experiments. If no one's interested, then I'll probably just do it on my own and maybe like snap a picture for Instagram. But I hope it was fun to kind of see all of the cool things that you can make with nature, and I definitely find it very fascinating and really fun to experiment, so I hope you guys enjoyed watching it too. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you again in the next one.